tell you a story about a man from Oklahoma. Woody Guthrie, who in the span of only a dozen years wrote over 1,000 American songs. And he didn't use an original melody for any one of them. For each one of those compositions, he recycled the tune from a familiar song and made up his own words. And most of those melodies came off the old 78 RPM recordings of the original Carter family from Hilton's, Virginia, Woody's favorite band. He just loved the Carter family. And the great testament to Woody's achievement is that millions of people still sing his songs today. He was christened Woodrow Wilson Guthrie 12 days after his namesake was nominated for the presidency, but everybody called him Woody. He inherited his father Charlie's marvelous optimism, and from his mother Nora, he inherited her love of the old ballads, as well as some of her madness. Back in 1907, just after statehood, Charlie Guthrie brought his family from Texas to Okemah. You see, the U.S. government kicked most of the Indians out of the former Indian Territory, and the brand new state of Oklahoma was well on its way to becoming the largest oil-producing region in the country. Woody's father, Charlie, was the first county clerk at the county seat of Okemah, and Woody always described his father as a hard-hitting, fist-fighting Democrat. Woody liked to tell people that his father was the man who miscounted the votes at election time. For a few years, Woody's father did pretty well speculating on real estate during the big oil boom. Woody said that by the time he was born, his father was quite well off. Charlie Guthrie built a nice 6-room house on 6th Street. Cost $800, a lot of money 100 years ago, and the neighbors said it was one of the finest houses in town. But as the oil market boomed and busted, Charlie Guthrie's luck played out, and Woody's family moved from one rental home to another. And Woody's childhood would have been fairly uneventful if not for the fires. When Woody was 4 years old, the October 5th, 1916 edition of the Okemah Ledger reported that Charlie Guthrie's house had been set on fire by an oil stove. One morning, 3 years later, Woody's mother kept Woody's 14-year-old sister Clara home from school. She needed help with the ironing, and there was an important test at school that day that Clara wasn't too happy about missing. Well, she and her mother got into a fight, and they argued, and somehow Clara spilled kerosene all over her dress, and it caught fire. The newspaper reported the fire was accidental, but the neighbors had their doubts. Clara was severely burned from her neck to her knees, and as she lay dying, she asked her 6-year-old brother Woody, she always called him Woodblock, she made him promise that he wouldn't cry. He did his best to keep his promise, running around the house in tears until he fell into his father's arms. But after Clara's funeral, he wasn't going to cry again. Just before Woody's 15th birthday, on a Saturday afternoon in the summer of 1927, Charlie Guthrie was taking a nap, and his wife, Nora, threw a lit kerosene lantern at him, burning him from his navel to his neck. And while Charlie lay in the hospital, his Masonic Lodge brothers quietly arranged for Woody's mother, Nora, to be committed to the Central State Hospital for the Insane in Norman, Oklahoma, where she died 2 years later. Charlie's burns were so bad he spent 18 months in the hospital, and the family split up. And young Woody, his sister, and 2 brothers were scattered. They spent the next few years living with local foster families. Woody lived with the Sam White family, 11 people sleeping in 3 beds in a 2-room shack. And 20 years later, in February of 1947, Woody was living on Mermaid Avenue in Coney Island, New York with his second wife, Marjorie, and their 4-year-old daughter, Kathy Ann. One day when Woody was out, Marjorie, who was 4 months pregnant with Arlo, went across the street to buy a quart of milk at the corner store. She was only gone for 5 minutes, but while she was out, a short circuit in the electrical cord of a recently repaired radio started a fire in the child's bed. And little Kathy Ann was horribly burned. Woody returned from work late that night and found a note pinned to the door of their apartment. Come to the Coney Island Hospital at once. The next morning, Kathy Ann died, there was no funeral. And a few nights later, Woody walked along a moonlit beach at Coney Island with two of his closest friends and fellow merchant marines, Cisco Houston and Jimmy Longy. Woody suddenly threw himself to the sand, his arms and legs in the air, raging at the night sky. He screamed for 30 seconds and then got up, and it was over. Friends said that Woody was never the same after Kathy Ann died. She was the inspiration for those magical and enduring children's songs that Woody composed during her brief childhood. And ironically, just a few months after her death, he recorded these songs for Moash's Folkways record label. They're still available on Smithsonian Folkways record CDs, called Nursery Days and Songs to Grow On for Mother and Child. And 6 years later, in the spring of 1953, Woody traveled out to Florida to visit Stetson Kennedy. Do you remember Stetson Kennedy? He's the man who infiltrated and unmasked the Ku Klux Klan. Well, early one morning, Woody was trying to rekindle the campfire, and he decided to splash some kerosene onto the smoldering logs. The flames jumped up, burning his right arm and face so badly, the puckered scars would leave him unable to play the guitar. As Woody's friend Pete Seeger used to say, the fire gods were after Woody. Woody was born on July 14th of 1912. Just 12 days after the governor of New Jersey, his namesake, Woodrow Wilson, was nominated for the presidency. Now, Wilson was an old-school Southern Democrat who believed in segregation because, as he put it, it removed friction between the races. His favorite movie was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, based on a novel called The Klansman. And during his presidency, the Klan actually had its biggest revival since Reconstruction. Now, Washington, D.C. was a strictly segregated town. Except for the federal government agencies, they'd been integrated since Reconstruction, and African Americans worked federal jobs side by side with whites. Well, once he took office, President Wilson segregated the federal government. And when he ran for president the second time in 1916, Wilson's campaign declared, "Vote for me, you vote for peace. Vote for the other guy, you vote for war." Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Months after his second inauguration, he got the United States into England and France's war with Germany. The American bankers invested heavily in both sides of the war, as they so often do. They knew they'd have a hard time getting their money back if Germany won the war. So the banksters sent their representatives to lobby President Wilson, and sure enough, in April 1917, President Wilson persuaded Congress to send American troops to fight against Germany in what we now call World War I, or as it was called 100 years ago, the war to end all wars. Tens of thousands of American veterans came home missing arms and legs and faces, struggling with depression and post-traumatic stress. And they were an ever-present painful reminder to family and friends of the unspeakable costs of foreign wars. Consequently, a lot of Americans started calling themselves isolationists. An isolationist is somebody who believes that our troops shouldn't participate in any war until the enemy is actually threatening the shores of North America. It's a far cry from the way we do things in the 21st century, but between World War I and World War II, half the voters in the United States were isolationists, and Woody Guthrie was among them. In the fall of 1937, Woody got a job at KFVD, a small 1,000-watt radio station in Los Angeles, California. And soon they were paying him $1 a day to sing his Dust Bowl ballads and expound on his then popular anti-war opinions. An economic depression had ravaged the United States for nearly a decade, and another war was brewing overseas in Europe, and once again the participants were England and France and Germany. Then, over Labor Day weekend of 1939, Hitler's army invaded Poland, and for the second time in a century, England declared war on Germany. And and World War II was a done deal. Now, in the United States, you can say whatever you want about the war when it's imminent, but once that war is declared, you better be careful what side of the fence you're on. And Woody Guthrie was decidedly on the wrong side of the fence. Woody believed that the job of a folk singer is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable. Well, in November, KFVD fired him for his left-wing politics. So there he was in Los Angeles as winter was approaching, without a jacket, a suitcase, or a guitar. But in his pocket he had a letter from his friend Will Geer. Does anybody remember Will Geer? When I was a teenager, Will Geer played the part of Grandpa Walton on a popular television show called The Waltons. And that was one of the few paying jobs Will could get in film or television because for years he'd been blacklisted. Blacklisted during the Red Scare for fear that he might be a fellow traveler of that dreaded Communist Party. Like Woody Guthrie. Now, Woody himself was never actually a member of the Communist Party because he was so disorganized and unpredictable. Nobody in their right mind would have invited him to join. But when this story took place, things were a little different for Will Geer. In 1939, Will Geer was one of the highest paid actors in New York City, playing the part of Jeter Lester in the hit Broadway play Tobacco Road. And Will Geer wrote to his pal Woody Guthrie saying, "Woody, if you can't get any singing work in LA, we'll get you some in New York City. And if nobody will pay you to sing, I'll get you a job on the stage crew because I'm the star of the show." So without a jacket, a suitcase, or a guitar, Woody Guthrie put that letter back in his pocket and began traveling east on Route 66, beginning the 3,000-mile journey across the continent. And every time he stopped for a cup of coffee or a cigarette or a sandwich, he heard the same song on every jukebox and radio station, a song that had been written by a man who was born in Mogilev, Russia, a man who immigrated to this country with his impoverished Jewish family and lived in squalor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a man who as a teenager worked as a singing waiter on the Bowery, and then in 1911, he wrote a song that sold over 1 million copies of sheet music in its first 3 months of publication. In 1917, he was drafted into the United States Army and stationed at Yaphank, New York. And there he composed an all-soldier musical revue called Yip Yip Yaphank. And for this show, he wrote a song about the United States. But it was such a flag-waving patriotic song, he didn't think anybody would like it in 1918 when popular songs talked about going over there and killing the Hun. So he stuck the song in his grape juice file. Now, are there songwriters listening? Do you know about the grape juice file? When you write a new song, it goes in the grape juice file. And in 20 or 30 years, you can check back and see if it turned to lousy vinegar or fine wine. Only time will tell. So 20 years later, in 1938, a singer by the name of Kate Smith asked this songwriter, she said, "Mr. Berlin, do you have any patriotic songs in your trunk?" And she recorded this song, and it was such a big hit that when Woody was traveling east in 1939, everywhere he went, every jukebox and radio station was playing Irving Berlin's song. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. Well, it's a great song, and that's why it's still sung in this century. God Bless America has earned more than $700,000 for the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America since 1938, when the composer Irving Berlin assigned the copyright to those two youth groups. But I remind you that Woody Guthrie hated this song. He hated this song because he was broke and hitchhiking, and Irving Berlin was a millionaire who rode around in a chauffeured limousine, who dined in restaurants and owned the Music Box Theater on Broadway. And when Irving Berlin wrote songs for the Hollywood movies, he retained his copyrights to those songs, something very few songwriters could command at any time in American history. But Woody had another reason to hate this song. He traveled back and forth across the country, from Okemah to California, from New York to Oregon during the Great Depression, when 1 out of 4 people couldn't get a job. And Woody saw those hungry mothers and fathers standing in long lines, thousands of people waiting online for a free loaf of bread or a bowl of soup, and he wanted to know how a millionaire like Irving Berlin could be so insensitive as to write a song called God Bless America when nobody could get a job. Now, you might think Woody was being sacrilegious, but he was just being practical. What all these unemployed Americans had in common was the desire to be just a little bit more blessed. So he said to himself, when I get to New York, I'm writing another song that says all the things about this country that God Bless America doesn't say. Well, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Woody got caught in a blizzard. He went to a local diner for a hot cup of coffee. Sitting at the counter, warming his hands, he heard a voice on the radio announce that God Bless America was going to replace the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem. Now, this might sound like a crazy idea today, but the Star-Spangled Banner didn't become our national anthem until the Hoover administration in 1931. And it's a 2-octave melody that practically nobody can sing, so it would in fact have been reasonable to replace it. And Woody thought, that does it. When I get to New York, I'm going to write a different song about this country. During that record winter storm, Woody tried to hitchhike out of Harrisburg, but most of the bridges were closed because of ice and snow. It was a passing forest ranger that found Woody shivering, lying in a snowbank on Route 22 and rescued him. He drove him to his own parents' house, and the ranger's mother and father filled Woody with bowls of hot buttered clam chowder and gave him $3 for a bus ticket to New York City. So without a jacket, a suitcase, or a guitar, Woody arrived in Manhattan on February 16th of 1940. Woody found his way through the frozen streets of New York City to the home of Will and Herta Gear at 59th Street and 5th Avenue. That building was torn down decades ago. Today it's an Apple store. Woody was impressed with their elegant apartment. When Will told him that the rent was $250, Woody thought that was for the whole year. Now, Woody had a well-earned reputation for being an imperfect house guest. Burleighs remember how Woody spent the night on his couch without removing his work boots, staining the fabric with mud. But Will Gear thought Woody Guthrie could do no wrong. Woody stayed with the Gears for a week, enjoying their considerable hospitality and sleeping on their living room couch. And Woody borrowed a guitar from Will's wife, Herta, a pre-World War II Brazilian rosewood Martin guitar that her mother had given her, and Will took Woody out on several auditions. Years later, Will remembered that for some inexplicable reason, Woody couldn't keep his hands from shaking. Singing in bars along the Bowery, Woody raised enough money to move on. That old Martin guitar he borrowed from Herta Gear would be worth thousands of dollars today, but not after Woody removed it from its case and carried it out into the blizzard. Herta Gear said that Woody never returned that guitar. He walked 18 blocks to the corner of 43rd Street and 6th Avenue, just one long block from the New York Public Library, where he checked into a low-rent rooming house that doesn't exist anymore called Hanover House. And there on the second floor at a wooden desk, with a yellow pencil like the children use in the classrooms and a piece of that lined notebook paper with the 3 holes punched in it, Woody sat down and wrote his song about the United States. He appropriated the tune from an old Carter family hymn that they recorded for Victor Records back in 1930. His lyric responded to Irving Berlin's song, God Bless America. He made one of the verses into a chorus and he put it into his own grape juice file. Because if you're going to write 1,000 songs in a dozen years, you gotta try to knock out one at least every day. He wrote compulsively, almost obsessively, on scraps of paper, empty cigarette packages, paper bags, napkins, and washroom paper towels. Somehow he seemed to understand that he didn't have a lot of time left. A decade later, Woody and Marjorie were living in Coney Island with their 3 children, Arlo, Jody, and Nora, and Woody was in a bad way. All of his friends could see it. He'd become so belligerent and despairing, especially if he had been drinking, that Marjorie didn't know what to do. One night in May of 1952, Woody got so violent that Marjorie had to call the police. But she was convinced that Woody's problem was more than alcoholism. He was often despondent and sometimes even suicidal. So the following month, at his wife's urging, Woody voluntarily checked himself into New York City's Bellevue Hospital. He was there for a month, but the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. So on July 22nd of 1952, Woody entered Brooklyn State Hospital. One day after 6 weeks of testing, the young doctor was reviewing the notes in Woody's file and noticed that Woody's mother had been institutionalized with an unidentified illness. It finally dawned on him, how come no one has ever said this guy has Huntington's disease? After a lifetime of speculation, Woody finally understood what had put his mother into that asylum in Norman, Oklahoma. A hereditary brain disorder called Huntington's disease. And there was no cure. With his health deteriorating, he made one last trip to California. It didn't go well. And finally, on September 16th of 1954, Woody checked himself back into Brooklyn State Hospital. As a voluntary patient, he was in and out of that hospital for another 2 years. At the end of May of 1956, an unshaven and scruffy Woody Guthrie checked himself out of Brooklyn State Hospital. He walked through the streets of Manhattan to the Central Park West apartment of Harold Leventhal, the man who managed the folk quartet The Weavers. Harold Leventhal and his wife Natalie returned from dinner to find Woody slumped in front of their door. They invited him in, and Woody attempted to light a cigarette, but his hand shook so badly he dropped it and burned a hole in their couch. He told Harold that he was broke, and Harold gave Woody a $20 bill and sent him out into the night. On May 28th of 1956, the Morris County, New Jersey police arrested Woody Guthrie for trespassing, the local interpretation of wandering aimlessly on a highway in a dazed condition. Woody explained to the cops that he was ill, that he should be taken to a hospital. Woody spent the night in the Morris County Jail, and the following morning, Dr. George Comeau determined that Woody needed to be restrained for the welfare of the patient and the safety of others. Judge Nelson K. Mintz committed Woody Guthrie to the New Jersey State Hospital at Greystone Park. Woody was only 43 years old. When he got to Greystone, he told the doctors, "What I have is called Huntington's disease. It's what my mother had. This is the same way my mother walked. This is just how she acted." But the doctors thought they knew better, and they classified him as schizophrenic reaction paranoid type. And Woody was there for 6 months before they took him at his word and changed his diagnosis to Huntington's disease. Harold Leventhal came to see how Woody was doing. The doctor looked at Woody's file and chuckled to himself. "This man is very sick," he said. "He's delusional. He says he wrote over 1,000 songs." Woody spent 4 years, 10 months, and 5 days at the New Jersey State Hospital at Greystone Park. He was case number 65935 in Ward 40, which Woody liked to call Wardy 40. And in the spring of 1961, a disabled Woody Guthrie shuffled out of the hospital, discharged by an overly optimistic doctor who had written the word improved on his chart. But it was wishful thinking, for within a year, Woody couldn't get around without a wheelchair. He spent the last 5 years of his life lying in a hospital bed in Brooklyn, slowly losing control of the muscles in his body. His wife Marjorie had divorced Woody and remarried. However, she made it clear to her new husband Al that she would be spending her time raising awareness of Huntington's disease and taking care of Woody in the hospital. She used to say, "Woody, would you like a sip of water through a straw?" and Woody would blink his eyes twice for yes, and once for no, as they were the last muscles he could still control. And as he lay there in that hospital bed, fighting that disease with all his remaining life force, that little song he'd written back at Hanover House, well, it went around the world, and without ever being played on the hit parade or the top 40, it has become one of the best-known English-language folk songs on the planet. This means that whatever country your family came from, whatever language they may have spoken at home, if they knew one song in English that wasn't Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Old MacDonald Had a Farm, or Happy Birthday to You, it was probably the one that Woody wrote in February of 1940 at Hanover House, at the corner of 43rd Street and 6th Avenue, just one long block from that New York Public Library. As I was walking that ribbon of a highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forests to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. Now, in the last 20 years, I've performed at thousands of schools from the Everglades to the Arctic Circle. I've sung this song with over 1.5 million students in 48 states, and I didn't have to teach them the words. They already knew the song. This is because I've never met an early childhood educator in any state who doesn't make it their personal responsibility to pass this song on to their students, usually teaching them one of the 3 benign verses Woody wrote about the American landscapes that he observed in his travels. But when Woody wrote this song at Hanover House in 1940, it was decidedly not a children's folk song. A couple of the verses just aren't the sort of thing you'd usually sing with small children. Most self-respecting kindergarten teachers won't touch them with an 11-foot pole. Woody's song was written in response to Irving Berlin's song, God Bless America. In fact, Woody was going to call his song God Blessed America for Me until he tried the words This Land is Your Land, finding them much more inclusive and universal. This is one of the verses he wrote at Hanover House. On a bright sunny morning, in the shadow of the steeple, by the welfare office, I saw my people as they stood there hungry. I stood there wondering if God blessed America for me. He wrote another verse at Hanover House that offers some insight into his worldview. There was a big high wall there that tried to stop me, and a great big sign there said private property. But on the other side, you know, it didn't say nothing. Well, that side was made for you and me. You ever wonder where Woody got the tune for this song? Look for the original recordings of the Carter family from Hilton's, Virginia. They're all on CD today. At a May 1930 session in Memphis, Tennessee, they recorded an old hymn, which was where Woody got his melody. I don't know if anybody still sings it today. Oh, my darling brother, when the world's on fire, do you want God's bosom to be your pillow? Won't you tide me over in the rock of ages? Oh, rock of ages, cleft for me. But we don't sing those words anymore, do we? We sing Woody's words. Nobody living can ever stop me as I go walking down freedom's highway. Nobody living can make me turn back, 'cause this land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forests to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me.